Yesterday, Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon holding a news conference talking about some of the issues here, a massive early voting turnout and what that may mean heading into the fall's race. Also talking about monitors from the Department of Justice at polling sites in Hennepin and Ramsey counties. But again, saying that this is not necessarily a unique situation here. Let's talk more about some of these things and bring in Secretary of State Steve Simon. Steve, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Let's get to that first. I mean, this is certainly a headline that attracts a lot of attention here about the monitors that the Department of Justice is sending about 20 staff from the Civil Rights Division's voting section and from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota in Hennepin and Ramsey counties. Now, obviously, again, this, catches a lot of voters' interest in what this means. You were very, very calm yesterday. Very, again, trying to make sure this is not an alarmist thing. You're saying that this is not unusual. We've seen it in previous elections. Talk more about this.
Yeah, that's right. This is not a fresh or new thing. This is something that for the last at least 4 elections, the Justice Department has sent these kinds of observers, and it's for a very limited purpose. It's not just a general look and see mission. They're really focusing in on specific parts of the Voting Rights Act that guarantee access for people with disabilities and for people who are American citizens but whose native language is not English. So this has been a longstanding thing that they do. It's really a small group. They're not going to be able to visit that many places. The good news is, just in an abundance of caution, the Attorney General's office, with our input, is watching the watchers. So they are literally in real time following the observers as they go from polling place to polling place. And I have to report no incidents. They're not taking pictures. They're not doing anything they shouldn't be doing. They are complying with the law. But I understand, this being Minnesota, home of the surge this last winter, I understand the anxiety that some people are feeling when they hear that the Justice Department or the federal government is sending someone here to do something around elections. But this is something we're familiar with. We're watching it, we're monitoring it, and so far, so good.
Yeah, and similar efforts made recently in Michigan and other states as well, but it seems like these are blue states or Democratic-led states that where these monitors have been sent. I mean, what's your understanding about the rationale for where these monitors are being sent?
Well, in terms of the foreign language piece, there's a real set formula about which jurisdictions even comply and have to comply with this part of the Voting Rights Act. So the overall scope is pretty narrow and limited. I don't know how they choose which states they're choosing. All I know is that in Minnesota, this is not new for us. This has been happening for at least the last 4, maybe longer elections under administrations of both political parties. But we're watching them. We're making sure that they're not doing anything they're not supposed to do, approaching voters when they're not supposed to approach them, approaching the polling place. Hennepin and Ramsey counties declined the invitation to have them in the polling place, which they can do. So they are out there with the rest of the public. You, me, and all your viewers can be outside the 100-foot perimeter of a polling place. That's anyone, whether it's DOJ or the guy down the street. And so they're entitled to be there. But so far, the observers report that the watchers of the observers report that they're doing what they need to do and they're abiding by our rules and laws, which is good. We just want to keep it that way.
What was the experience in 2020, 2022, and 2024 when similar observers were in Minnesota? What were the reports or feedback from those years?
Same thing, uneventful. They complied with the law. They didn't sort of harass or intimidate voters. They were just there to gather information about disability access and about access to non-English language materials for American citizens who maybe were born somewhere else. So we're cautiously optimistic that this is going to turn out okay. But look, we got 7.5 hours plus to go. And we got folks who have eyes on them the whole time and following them wherever they go. So I think it'll be okay.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit too about the turnout. You mentioned yesterday, as of Monday anyway, 206,000 early votes, setting a record for a non-presidential election year primary in Minnesota.
Yeah, it's 24 people absentee, so I'm sure that number is going to climb when we look back on it. Yeah, I mean, this is an election that people are caring about. It's inspired a lot of enthusiasm and passion. And it's perceived as close in a couple of the particular contests. And really, that's the difference in Minnesota and most places, I think, between a general election and a primary. In Minnesota, we really pride ourselves on most years being #1 in America in voter turnout in the November election. And people do it out of a sense of pride and duty and obligation and citizenship. It's just not that way with primaries. It's so driven by who and what is on the ballot. And so you can't necessarily draw a straight line between our super high stratospheric general election turnout and primary turnout. But this might be the difference. The modern day record was in 2018. Then, as now, there were some really interesting and close contests in both major political parties. And at that time, in 2018, the final turnout was somewhere between 22 and 23%. Which for a primary, especially an August primary in Minnesota, is pretty high. So it's certainly possible that we could meet and exceed that given the enthusiasm and the turnout indicators that we're seeing so far.
We do have a couple of questions from viewers that we wanted you to address. And the first one kind of heads back to some of the polling location and monitors, et cetera. So let's bring this one up here. The question is, I guess, do we have the full screen for that? No. The question, I'll just read it to you then. Sure. What specific protocols are in place to safeguard polling locations against voter intimidation or unauthorized interference on primary day? So protocols in place to safeguard against interference.
Yeah, great question, and a very relevant question. So here's the deal. We're really blessed in Minnesota to have really good, strong, precise laws. The precision part is really important. It's not just loose and airy. For example, in Minnesota, the law is the only folks who can be in a polling place are voters, of course, election workers, anyone who naturally works in that building, the church, the school, the city hall, etc. And each major political party can send one, only one, not a mob, not a swarm of people, one person to be a representative of that political party, to be a so-called challenger. Even then, our laws are very precise. No challenger may speak to a voter. No challenger may stand within 6 feet of a voter. And they can only issue challenges to a voter based on personal knowledge. That's the exact phrase in the law. So it can't be a whim or a hunch or a feeling or a vibe or anything like that. Even as to law enforcement, we have strict rules. And by the way, these have been here for many decades. These aren't fresh or new. So as to law enforcement, federal, state, or local, the rule in Minnesota is you can't preemptively post law enforcement at a polling place, even if it comes from the best of intentions. Even a kind-hearted sheriff or police chief who says, just to calm everyone down, I'm going to put a cop at the door or a sheriff's deputy at the entrance. You can't do that in Minnesota. What you can do is even 1 minute after the polls open, they can obviously always respond to an incident. So if, for example, a fist fight breaks out in the polling place, of course you can call the cops. Of course you can call the sheriff's office. But you can't beforehand, for no reason, post someone there. And that ought to make some people feel a little bit more safe and secure, particularly as to the federal government. For those who, in view of the ICE surge, are anxious about that, that ought to give some people some comfort. And that's not even counting the federal and state anti-voter intimidation laws that we have that say that anyone, law enforcement or anyone else, who's harassing, threatening, or intimidating, they can be bounced, they could even be arrested, and it's a crime to engage in those behaviors. So I think in terms of the law, we've got that covered. And we do have a really good tradition in Minnesota of having very calm polling places. We really only very rarely have incidents.
All right. Another question, and this is one, right from the age of social media. This viewer, Joy, asks, can I take a photo of my completed ballot? Only the ballot. No people or surroundings. People like to post that they voted and wondering if, or keep a record of their ballot. Can they do that?
Yes. And this has been decided by the courts over the years. It was litigated, but the bottom line is yes. Some people call them ballot selfies. You can take a ballot selfie. Just don't take a picture of someone else. But if you want to pose with your ballot or take a picture of your ballot and send it or post it, you can do that. That is perfectly legal.
Good to know. In terms of, the questions about election security, I don't know, yesterday in the news conference going over the process, but let's talk about this again in in the precincts and the counties, the way that ballots are tabulated, and then the way it's brought in with the absentee ballots. Walk us through again this process and how people can be assured that there's no way for outside interference or hackers or something to influence this.
Well, the first thing I always tell people is, remember, we are a paper ballot state. We vote on paper. We don't vote on machines or push buttons. We have good old-fashioned paper, which you can touch and feel and see and audit. There's always an audit trail with paper. So how does it work? Well, it's your friends and neighbors, the election judges, the poll workers who are in the polling place. And at the end of the night at 8:01, after the polls close, they start that tabulation process. So what happens is that there are unofficial results, and they're always just unofficial, subject to later proving up and making sure the math lines up. But on election night, you have these unofficial results. Some counties, those can be modemed in through a secure system to the nerve center at a county. Others, like Ramsey County, for example, they have people drive them in. And when they drive them in, those results, that's a specific task in state law that requires political balance. You can't have just one person of one political party drive those in. It's got to be a couple people at the same time. Then they go to the county, and the county looks over those numbers as well. And when everything's in, they will post those numbers too. Afterwards, the county has to go through kind of a reckoning process. And then we do the same thing with post-election audits and reviews at the state level after that. So there's multiple layers of review to make sure the math lines up, that the ballots match up, that everything's on the up and up, and everything is something that anyone can watch. You know, at 8:01, anyone in Minnesota, any one of your viewers can go into any polling place, not just their own, and watch as the tabulation process happens. If you live in St. Paul and you want to go in the one in Minnetonka or vice versa, you can do that. Once the polls are closed, it's totally open. Anyone can come in and watch what's going on.
And then tabulating the absentee ballots or the mail-in votes as well. And I have witnessed this process take place in which these are carefully removed from the envelopes. And it's usually, isn't there a double envelope procedure too? And then there are observers selected from both parties there to then go through and transfer what was mailed in onto an actual official ballot. What you are mailing in is not an official ballot. I think people should know that, right? It's transferred over to another ballot.
Well, I see what you're saying on that. It is an official ballot, but there is that separate process that you're talking about, these absentee ballot boards. And I just witnessed one today, as I often do on election day. I'm going around and visiting people and various elections offices. So what happens is a party balanced body called an absentee ballot board will look at those absentee ballots that come in through the mail or are hand delivered, and they will determine whether it even goes into the pile to be counted. Someone else does the counting, but they in the first instance have to determine, okay, did the voter do it right? Did they sign it? Did they have a witness sign it? Is there some defect in the ballot, just some sort of physical defect? If everything's on the up and up, then it goes into the pile to be tabulated and counted. And again, that is a thing with party balance under state law. And that's something that we've had for quite a number of years in Minnesota. So yeah, that's the ones that are cast before election day. But critically, in Minnesota, everything's blended and merged together. We're not one of those states where you say, oh man, candidate A is ahead among the mail voters, but let's see if she can maintain that lead with those who voted election day. Nope, they're all mixed in, all merged together after the polls close. So you can't tell whose vote total was higher in one method or the other method of voting. Everything's blended together after polls closed, and they're all reported as just one unified result for a particular county.
Yeah, and then a process too, we should point out, to make sure that those that have come in by mail aren't duplicates, that same person showed up at a polling place.
Exactly right. Once in a while that can happen. I'll give you just a quick example. Let's say someone sends in their mail ballot, and they're just getting nervous about whether it's going to arrive in time or not. They're checking the website, which you can do, by the way, at mnvotes.gov. You don't have to wonder whether your mail ballot arrived in time. But let's say that someone this morning is checking to see if their ballot that they mailed several days ago arrived, and they don't see that it's arrived yet. And they say, you know what, I just don't want to risk it. I'm going to go in and vote in person. You can still do that. You're not bound by that prior choice. But when you do that, the ballot that's on its way in will be nullified. And so that when it arrives, it'll be destroyed. So just extending this hypothetical, let's say someone goes in this morning, they're like, I got up this morning, it's not on the website. You know what, I'm just going to go in and vote in person. And then the ballot does arrive later this afternoon. There will be no double counting. one of the first things that's done is to make sure that that person hasn't already voted. And you get those numbers and those results in real time. So what will happen is that absentee ballot that came in later will just be nullified, it will be destroyed, it will not be counted.
Okay. Thanks for the time today. No busy day for you, as it'll get busier throughout the day. But Secretary of State Steve Simon, thanks for the time.
Thanks for having me.
All right.